Why do people pick at their own skin compulsively sometimes? And why do people sometimes pluck out their own hair compulsively? Someone recently asked me if these were always caused by trauma, childhood trauma perhaps. So these things, picking at one's skin, called dermatillomania, and plucking out one's own hair compulsively, trichotillomania, are these caused by trauma? Well, I would have to say, in my experience, I would say yes, they are. And read about it a little bit online. It seems like people who do display these behaviors recount a higher incidence of childhood trauma. So science does agree with that to a degree. What I don't agree with what science does is, let's just take these people, give them a little cognitive behavioral therapy. If that doesn't work, let's just stick them on psychiatric medications. So, don't quite agree with that. But I'd like to just think about some of the people who I've known who have this behavior. And by the way, this is not former therapy clients of mine. These are people I've just known out in the world, and to some degree myself included. Let me start with myself. I know that at various points in my life, when I was under extremely high stress, I would pick at my cuticles right here, really pick, make myself bleed sometimes, just pick. And it gave me such a sense of comfort and relief. And that's what I've heard from so many people who pick at themselves and pluck things out of themselves. They know at some level it's not good. They know it can cause problems in their life. It can make them look different and strange and even be alienated, but it feels good. It's a tension reliever. So in one way, yes, it can be triggered by stress in life, but in my case, it did come from a history of unresolved childhood trauma, all sorts of things that happened to me when I was younger that were so painful and terrible that I just had to push down and bury, had no way to deal with them, no way to express my frustration and anger and rage, so I would just turn it on myself sometime. It made sense to me at some unconscious subliminal level. And then sometimes it would go away. Sometimes I was more relaxed in my life, but in times of stress, in times of pain or neglect or emotional overwhelm, 10, 20 years after any trauma might have happened, it's like sometimes, I would revert to that comfort-seeking, self-soothing behavior of just picking at myself. It was like giving myself some control in my life, some place to express those buried feelings. Thankfully, in my case, it wasn't too extreme, but I've talked to people, observed it even in people I've lived with sometimes who had behaviors that were much more extreme, like people picking their nose to the point that it was constantly bleeding, even had a hole through the inside of their nose, just compulsively picking it when they got stressed out, or plucking out so much hair compulsively that they got a big bald patch, or plucking out their eyebrows compulsively. All of these people who I've talked to, especially when I really got to know them, all had trauma. Now what's interesting is some didn't necessarily think of themselves, especially when they were younger, as being traumatized in any way. And I think that was part of it. It's like being not even aware of one's own trauma sometimes can signify how deep the trauma is buried, how out of access it is to healing. But as I've gotten to know these people better, get to know their stories better, as they've grown older and gotten to know their own stories better, a lot of times the trauma becomes more clear. The long-standing trauma, the history of trauma that was chronic, it shines a light on how restricted these people's lives were on the inside, how difficult it was to heal, how difficult it was to know one's own story, how difficult it was to find healthier ways to self-soothe, and that sometimes picking at oneself, almost like a little child, just going at oneself, picking and plucking and hurting oneself to self-soothe, was all there was. Now one might say, why didn't the person self-soothe like this? Well, it's like maybe that in some way wasn't enough. I think sometimes the feeling the pain, feeling the torment, in some ways did connect the person with the trauma and could soothe at an even deeper level. And I think this isn't just confined to humans. I remember after my parents split up, our family dog, who had always had access to go outside, roam in the countryside, roam in the forest, so much free time out when he wasn't on a leash, could run and play and disappear for an hour into the woods if he wanted. When my parents split up, my mother moved to New York City and she inherited the dog. How old was he then? 9, 10 years old, getting to be an older dog, maybe even 11 at that point. Well, he suddenly was locked in a very small New York City apartment. She was off working all day and he was alone all the time. She would walk him before work once on a leash. She would walk him after work on a leash, and that was it. This was a dog who had had freedom his whole life, and suddenly his life shrunk. It was torment for him, absolute torment. This wasn't puppyhood trauma, this was adult trauma. And he was just overwhelmed. He became a nervous wreck. And he started biting at himself and chewing himself and ripping out his own fur. And I saw this. And it was like, this was a dog's version of Dermatillomania or Trichotillomania or both. It was like he had nowhere else to express his frustration and his sadness and his anxiety and his horror and his desire to escape. He couldn't rip down the door. If he could have ripped down the door, he would have done that. He wouldn't have ripped himself apart, but he went at himself instead. And I've seen this with other animals, just biting themselves, biting holes in themselves when they don't have any options for freedom, when they can't find any better way to escape the misery of their lives. And I think people are like this at some primitive level. When we can't find our internal freedom, when we can't work out our traumas, when we have no way to express how we're feeling and find love and find comfort and find soothing and find ways to relieve our anxiety, when we can't find ways to grieve the losses of our life and replenish our life with healthiness, sometimes we go at ourselves and attack ourselves, just like sort of like a primitive animal. And in this way, I think it's just a normal human process to do this, given a very abnormal, unhealthy, external situation in our life, present or past.